periodic table has more than 100 elements, and it is really very difficult to remember these elements in the order of their atomic numbers. So we have come up with a strategy which will help you to remember the elements of the periodic table in order of their atomic numbers. In fact, we have created some storylines which will help you to remember these. So what we have done is we will go period by period. That is, first we'll talk about period 1, then period 2, period 3, and so on. And for every period, we have a memory tip which relates to a story, and we have a picture on the screen. So if you look at the picture very nicely, and if you kind of remember the picture, you actually remember the memory tip, which in turn helps you to remember the order of the elements in that period. So let's get started with period 1. What happens when you normally meet your grandpa and he says you hi? So how do you respond? You say hello. So hi, hello is our memory tip for period 1. So here on the screen you see that on top left we have a smaller version of the periodic table which tells you where exactly period 1 elements are located, and here a bigger version of period 1 elements which will get filled as we discuss each of the elements. So the memory tip hi reminds of hydrogen. So hi is hydrogen with symbol H. Hello reminds of helium. So hello is helium. So our memory tip for period 1 is hi, hello. Let's move on to period 2. So what do we see on the screen now? So here we see a burning car and a lion below the burning car. So of course you can imagine that how the lion must be feeling right now. So the lion must be craving for life and it needs oxygen urgently, right? So the memory tip here is lion below burning car needs oxygen for new life. So what does this reminds us of? So lion reminds of lithium. Li in lion, Li in lithium. So lion reminds of lithium. Below reminds of beryllium. So Be. So below is beryllium. Burning reminds of boron. So burn boron. So burning is boron. Car of course reminds of carbon with symbol C. Needs, N in needs, again N in nitrogen, so needs reminds of nitrogen. Oxygen of course is oxygen. For reminds of fluorine. And new life reminds of neon. So finally our memory tip for elements in period 2 would be lion below burning car needs oxygen for new life. Now, if you just remember this picture, that's enough. So remembering the picture, you will be able to remember the memory tip, and once you remember the memory tip, you very easily remember the name of the elements. Let's move on to period 3. So what do you think is our memory tip looking at the picture that we have on the screen? So we have a dirty magician who is doing some sort of magic with mobile phones, and in fact we see that some 6 mobile phones have been kind of hanging in the air, and that's his classic art. So the memory tip here is Saudi magician aligned 6 phones successfully, classic art. So here Saudi reminds of sodium with symbol Na. Magician reminds of magnesium. So mag in magician, mag in magnesium. So that's magnesium. Aligned reminds of aluminium. 6 is silicon. So 6 silicon. Phones reminds of phosphorus. Successfully reminds of sulfur. Su in successfully, Su in sulfur. So successfully reminds of sulfur. Classic reminds of chlorine. So chlorine, classic, similar. Art reminds of argon. So finally, the memory tip for elements in period 3 would be sodium, magnesium. So finally, the memory tip for elements in period 3 would be Saudi magician aligned 6 phones successfully, classic art. Moving on to period 4, we see on the screen that there is a principal who is telling something to the science teacher, and the teacher is getting really irritated. Now here, if you look at period 4, there are huge number of elements in period 4, and that is why we have divided it into 2 sections. So right now we will only discuss about the first section. So looking at the picture, you see that the memory tip for period 4 would be principal called science teacher very cruel, ma'am irritated. So here principal reminds of potassium. P in principal, P in potassium. However, the symbol for potassium is K. So please remember that. So principal reminds of potassium. Called reminds of calcium. So you have cal in called, again cal in calcium. So called reminds of calcium. Science reminds of scandium with symbol SC. Teacher reminds of titanium. Very reminds of vanadium. Cruel reminds of chromium. So you have cr and cruel, cr and chromium. So cruel, chromium. Ma'am reminds of manganese. And irritated reminds of iron. So IR in irritated, IR in iron. However, the symbol for iron is Fe. So what's our final memory tip for the first half of period 4 elements? That's principal called science teacher very cruel, ma'am irritated. Let's move on to the next half of period 4 elements. So can you guess by looking at the image on the screen? So here we see a cobbler named Nick, and we also see an art gallery, some German art gallery where you have some zinc girl statues, and we also see another guy who is kind of, in tears, is crying. So the story here is cobbler Nick copied zinc girl German art, selfish brother cried. So here this gallery is basically the zinc girl German art gallery. Okay, so here cobbler reminds of cobalt, Nick nickel, copied reminds of copper, zinc is of course zinc, girl reminds of gallium, German germanium, art reminds of arsenic with symbol AS and not AR. AR is argon, so arsenic is AS. Selfish reminds of selenium. So cell in selfish, cell in selenium. So selfish reminds of selenium. Brother reminds of bromine. So you have a bro in brother, you have a bro in bromine. And finally, cried reminds of krypton. So here, just focus on the pronunciation. So in cried, you have cr. In krypton, you have cr. So cried, krypton. So finally, the memory tip for the elements in the second half of period 4 is cobbler Nick copied zinc girl German art, selfish brother cried. Moving on to period 5. Again, we have divided period 5 into 2 halves. So right now we will focus only on the first half. So what do we see here? So we see that it's a zoo where we have a lot of animals, but at the same time there are a lot of dirt and dust littered around. So it's kind of a dirty zoo. We see a big and dangerous rhino. We also see a little girl named Ruby and also a monk. So the story here is this little girl was stuck in this dirty zoo, and the monk comes and he somehow handles and tackles this big rhino. So our memory tip would be Ruby struck in yuck zoo, nice monk tackled the rude rhino. So Ruby reminds of rubidium, struck reminds of strontium, yuck reminds of yttrium with symbol Y. Zoo reminds of zirconium, nice is niobium, monk is molybdenum, tackled is technetium, rude is ruthenium, and finally rhino is rhodium. So our final memory tip for the elements of first half of period 5 would be Ruby struck in yuck zoo, nice monk tackled rude rhino. Moving on to the second half of period 5. Here we see a girl praying. In fact, we also see that the girl is not only praying in front of the god, but looks like that she has put a coin into the tin container and she's telling that I exceed. I think this is a very common scenario for all of you during exam time. When you visit temples, you pray to God that, okay, I put a 1 rupee coin before you, but please get me good score in exam. So that's a very common scenario which you can relate to. So here your memory tip would be pay silver coin in tin and tell I exceed. So here Pay reminds of palladium. Silver is, of course, silver. However, the symbol for silver is Ag. Coin reminds of cadmium. In reminds of indium. Teen is teen again. And is antimony. So you have an in and, you also have an in antimony. So it's and reminds us of antimony, but the symbol for antimony is Sb. Tel reminds of tellurium. I reminds of iodine, and exceed reminds of xenon with symbol Xe. So basically when you look at exceed, so it reminds you of Xe, and Xe is the symbol of xenon. So our memory tip for second half of period 5 would be Pay silver coin in teen and tell I exceed. Let's now look at period 6. Now, in period 6, we have huge number of elements. In fact, we have a total of 32 elements in period 6. So, if you look at period 6, here it includes the entire lanthanide series. Like this is the first element of period 6, second element, and the third block that you see, the pink block, it represents the entire lanthanide series. So, right now, we will focus on the first 2 elements and first 5 elements of the lanthanide series. Now let's look at the picture that we have here. So we have the picture of Sister Barry Lanthony, and she is telling that I certify that the news is correct. So the memory tip for us would be Sister Barry Lanthony certified press news promptly. So here Sister reminds of cesium with symbol Cs. Barry reminds of barium with symbol Ba. Lanthony reminds of lanthanum. Certified for cerium, press for praseodymium, news for neodymium, and promptly for promethium. So our final tip for this first few elements of period 6 would be Sister Barry Lanthony certified press news promptly. Now another interesting thing here is Lanthony reminds us that the lanthanide series starts from here, because the first element of the lanthanide series is lanthanum. So lanthany is for lanthanum. So wherever you have lanthany, that is the beginning of the lanthanide series. So the lanthanide series starts with lanthanum, followed by cerium, praseodymium, neodymium, promethium, and so on. Now let's move on to the rest of the elements of lanthanide series. So what do we see on the screen? We see a group of teachers and they are discussing something. So they are discussing that today, in today's world, it's corruption all around. So there is no peace, corruption everywhere. Now they are reading some holy era books and are saying that there was no loot during those times. There used to be no corruption, no loot, and it used to be peace all around. So they are saying that, so remembering that holy era thought, they are asking each other that why loot today? So the memory tip here is some European godly teachers discussed holy era thought, why loot? So here some reminds of samarium with symbol SM, European reminds of europium, godly for gadolinium, teachers for terbium, discussed for dysprosium, holy for holmium, era for erbium, thought for thulium, Y for ytterbium with symbol YB, and loot for lutetium. So our memory tip for the next set or the final set of the lanthanide series would be some European godly teachers discussed holy era thought, why loot? Now let's move on to the next set of elements for period 6. So here we see a saint named Hafiz who is sitting at the Iranian plateau and he is trying to control the rains with his tantrums. So our memory tip here is Hafiz tantrum tamed rain of Iranian plateau. Now please remember to spend some time on each slide trying to focus on the image, because if you look at the image very carefully, that image will be there in your mind, and that will help you to remember the tip more easily. So here Hafiz reminds us of hafnium, tantrum for tantalum, tamed for tungsten. Now here an interesting thing is, though tungsten starts with T and it's tungsten, the symbol is W. Rain for rhenium, off for osmium, Iranian for iridium, so IR in Iranian, IR in iridium, so that's how they match. Plateau for platinum, so that's PT. So finally, the memory tip for this set of elements of period 6 would be Hafiz tantrum, tamed rain of Iranian plateau. Finally, the last set of elements of period 6. We see on the screen a golden Mercedes and a police who is arresting the radicals, some 2-3 radicals, which are people with some kind of negative thought in the society. So the memory tip here would be gold murk that led British police arrest radicals. So gold is of course gold. Murk reminds of mercury with symbol Hg. That reminds of thallium with symbol Tl. Lead is again lead. British reminds of bismuth with symbol Bi. Police reminds of polonium with symbol Po. Arrest reminds of astatine. And radicals reminds of radon. So our memory tip for this last set of elements of period 6 would be gold murk that led British police arrest radicals. Now let's move on to period 7. And here we see a French radio actor who's telling that, bro, I have proofs of beriberi in California, and he is trying to inform his nephew named Pluto who lives in America. So our tip here is French radio actor through proofs urged nephew Pluto in America to cure beriberi in California. So here French reminds of francium with symbol Fr, radio reminds of radium, actor for actinium, through for thorium, proofs for protactinium, urged for uranium, nephew for neptunium, Pluto is plutonium, America is americium, cure is curium, beriberi is berkelium, and California is californium. So our final memory tip for the elements of period 7 would be francium, radium. So these are the elements, and the memory tip would be French radio actor through proofs urged nephew Pluto in America to cure beriberi in California. So in period 7 as well, we have a total of 32 elements, and inside this period 7, we have the actinide series. So the element actinium marks the beginning of the actinide series. So when you have actor reminds you of actinium, and actinium tells you that the actinide series have begun. Now let's move on to the second half of the actinide series. So we see here Einstein who says that I meld noble laws. The term meld means to mix or to blend. Now, as we all know that Einstein was a scientist who has a lot of contribution in the field of physics, and he firmly had made a lot of noble laws. So the tip here is I firmly meld noble laws, where I is Einstein. So the element name is Einsteinium with symbol Es. Firmly is for fermium. Meld is for Mendelevium. Noble is for nobelium, and laws is for Lawrentium. So our memory tip would be I firmly meld noble laws. Now let's move on to the remaining elements of period 7. So what do you see on the screen? We see a RDX bomb maker, and he has kind of, faced or he has been encountered by the royal cop named Nihan. So our tip here is RDX bomb maker has met daring royal cop Nihan. Here R reminds of Rutherfordium with symbol RF, D for dubnium with symbol DB, S for seaborgium, bomb maker reminds of borium, has for hassium, met for meternium, daring for Darmstadtium, royal for Roentgenium, cop for Copernicum, and Nihan for Nihonium. So our final memory tip for these remaining elements of period 7 would be RDS bomb maker has met daring royal cop Nihan. Now, if you remember each memory tip or each storyline, you would be definitely able to remember the elements of that particular period. But now the question is, how can we remember the sequence of these storylines? So for that, we have one single story which will help you to remind the sequence of the storylines. So this story is about how you start your day. So you start your day, your grandfather wishes you hi and you reply him hello, and that's how your day starts. Then you take up your car, which reminds you of the storyline of the burning car. You take your car and go to a magic show, which again reminds you of the magician, the Saudi magician who was doing some magics with the phone. Now, after attending the magic show, it's your time to go to your school. So you go to your school and there you see that your science teacher was told by the principal that she was very cruel, which made her irritated. Now, once you're done with your school, while coming back home, just outside your school, you have your cobbler friend Nick. So, and that day Nick was very happy because he was able to copy the famous Zinc Girl German art. So he was very happy. And to celebrate his happiness, you along with Nick went to the zoo. But unfortunately, the zoo was very dirty and yucky and you were somehow trapped there. But then a nice monk came and saved you both. So after coming back from the zoo, you went to the temple and you thanked the Lord that, you were kind of saved from the zoo and you are safe. So you thanked the Lord. So this, while you thank the Lord, this reminds you of the memory tip which says that you pay a coin in the tin and you tell that I exceed. And you are done. So you are done for the day. So you come home, you sleep for the day. When you wake up next day morning, it's time for newspaper. So when you open the newspaper to have a look at the headlines, you see that Sister Barry Lanthony has finally certified that the news is correct. And this news is basically about the loot and all the bad things that's happening around us. So there is a lot of discussion happening regarding why this loot, why so much of loot everywhere around. And it was found that one of the causes of this loot is the lack of rain or drought, which has happened in Iran. Now, besides that, in the international section of the newspaper, you also saw that the British police could actually arrest the radicals who were involved in the Golden Mercedes case. And you also found that in America, there's this Dr. Pluto who would be working to find out a cure for beriberi in America. So after